following regulations are in effect immediately. All Red Cross supplies must be reported to the duty officer by 2200 hours.
Müller, Schmidt, Klein, Brandt, Meyer, get aboard!
Auf Wiedersehen! Bye-bye!
April 18th, 1944. Hearne, Texas. The midday sun sat like a hot iron over the flat prairie, and the air smelled of dust, oil, and the faint, impossible sweetness of distant kitchens. You stand on the packed ground beside a line of concrete barracks and watch a freight train roll to a stop on a spur that runs behind Camp Hearne. Men in olive drab shirts and steel helmets climb down from the boxcars, barking orders into the heat. They are American MPs. Corporal James Mallory, Sergeant Major in the Temporary Prison Detachment, a scar running along his jaw. Private Earl Jensen, still young enough for the sweat to show on his raw face. They are clean. They move with weary, efficient courtesy. They have rations ready, coffee, bread, and the smell of steak on a skillet. The prisoners climb down the other side. They are German soldiers, faces shaped under caps of Feldgrau and cracked leather helmets, belts creaking with the weight of their grenades and Mauser bayonet frocks. An Oberleutnant named Carl Weber steps out first, a square-jawed officer with an old scar across his temple, a yellowing 2nd Infantry Division patch still stitched on the sleeve of his tunic. He is followed by Feldwebel Dieter Voigt, his boots missing the outer polish of a soldier who had expected to march home to parades. And beside them, a handful of men with the black and red SS cuff titles that make the air itself colder for some American guards who spot them. The Americans file them in by the hundreds across the yard, counting, frisking, and listing names while the Texas heat glints off the MP's polished badges. They had been prepared. German propaganda had trained them to expect the worst. Greasy-handed prison guards, starvation, beatings, humiliation. Rumors circulated on the train in broken English and German, of lynchings, of burials in shallow graves, of men disappeared into holes in the earth. Weber carries all of that with him like a lead weight. You can see it in the way he tightens his jaw under the sun,
No, thank you.
in the
Give
way
it to
his
the children.
eyes flick from face to face, assessing threat. Around him the men breathe hard, their hands calloused from rifle stocks, their uniforms ragged from weeks on the front. An MP taps Weber's shoulder and, in clipped but careful German, says, "Herr Offizier, water, mess, bedrolls." The phrase is simple. The reality is not. The first sensory contradiction comes in the form of a metal tray and a remarkably polite corporal. "Line up for chow," Corporal Mallory calls. The prisoners shuffle forward into a long tent that smells of coffee, so strong it seems to cut through memory. Steam rises from a set of pots. Men who had been living on hardtack and thin soups in foxholes stare at the scene. Real plates, real cutlery, and a table where a hulking black cook ladles out stew and, with practiced American efficiency, passes along cuts of beef sizzling in butter. The fryers hiss. A slab of steak is set upon a man's tray. Someone, a guard or a civilian volunteer, hand delivers a wrapped pack of cigarettes along with a small carton of milk. You can almost hear the internal cogs grind. For many of the enlisted men, the coffee, the buttered bread, and the cigarette feel like a strange, guilty indulgence. Their hands tremble just enough as they lift a fork. For the SS men, it is different. Mocking laughter at first, then a tightening of the mouth as the implication sinks in. How could the enemy afford such food? How could the enemy treat prisoners with such civility? A corporal of the SS, Friedrich Huber, snatches his tray and tosses the steak aside with a disgusted clang. He spits the English words he knows, propaganda, and the room grows taut as string. But others tuck in, suspicious at first, then hungry, then grateful in silence. Outside the mess tents, the camp hums with an odd domesticity. A Red Cross truck has arrived, white canvas gleaming, and trunks of parcels, jam jars, soap, tins of meat, are being stacked along the fence. Young American civilian volunteers in simple dresses and shirts lug boxes with awkward smiles. They hand out candy to prisoners who, out of habit, refuse at first and then, in tiny private rebellions, unwrap the sweets and hide them in pockets. There is work to be done, latrines to be dug, garden plots to be cleared for vegetables, stockades to be maintained. The camp is not a battlefield. It is infrastructure, the very kind of organized abundance Wehrmacht propaganda insisted only decadent democracies could afford. And here it is, in the middle of Texas. Carl Weber sits a while, hands folded over a plate he cannot quite finish. He watches an American sergeant walk past. The sergeant's uniform frayed at the collar, broad-shouldered, carrying a metal mug that bears a simple inscription, Texas 1943. He cannot match the sergeant's easy manner with his own tightly controlled posture. Between the two men are other distances. Language, ideology, a war that had been for them an absolute test of racial destiny. The sight of an enemy soldier drinking the same coffee tastes like a foreign truth. At sundown, the camp lights click on in rows, and shadows of mess tents stretch long across sand. Men are assigned bunks in barracks built of rough pine, stamped with a Red Cross crest and the stenciled words, POW barracks. The bunks are narrow but clean. Blankets are issued. A young American nurse, Lieutenant Margaret Ellis, walks along the rows handing out toothbrushes and a printed leaflet about camp rules. Her voice is efficient. Her eyes are soft. A German corporal reaches out and takes the leaflet with a hand that has dirt still embedded in the nail beds. He nods once, more to himself than to her. That night, as the stars over Texas wheel bright and indifferent, small clusters of prisoners whisper into darkness. Some pray. Some smoke cigarettes until the light dies. The questions multiply. Is this kindness a trick? Is it the calm before a worse storm? For the SS men, the alarm grows. The enemy's largesse is not weakness. It is a mirror that reflects the bankruptcy of their own certainty. For the others, it is a bewildering relief, a new, dangerous kind of hope. Outside the barracks, an American guard unwraps a piece of steak and tosses a crust to a dog, a small ritual of civilized life that, for these men, feels like a betrayal of everything they were taught. Over the following days, Camp Hearn settled into a rhythm that disoriented as much as it ordered. Dawn brought roll calls under a sky the color of bleached metal. The bugle's notes slid over the compound like a promise. Work details were organized. Men who could mend roofs were set to carpentry, those with mechanical skill to the motor pool, and farmers to the vegetable patches that fed both prisoners and guards. The Americans instituted programs meant to keep order and stave off boredom. English classes run by chaplains, small theatrical performances in the recreation hall, and a library of donated books stacked neat as a small town's pride. For the prisoners, these were luxuries that outran comprehension. A man who had come from a bombed-out town near Minsk could not at first understand why a library existed inside a prison. He walked its narrow aisles like a pilgrim. Letters began to arrive, not from home, but from the Red Cross, stamped and carefully censored, small bundles of news and soap and the odd comforting object. A box labeled to POWs from the American Red Cross might contain talcum powder, canned fruit, and a bar of chocolate wrapped in wax paper. The scent of coffee in the morning now mingled with the tinge of citrus from a tin of grapefruit sent to a prisoner named Joseph Kramer, who opened it as though it were an artifact. He remembered orchard from childhood, and for a moment the war seemed like a very long bad dream you could wake from. He passed the fruit quietly to his tent mate, an exchange small as a heartbeat, and both men sat in the dawn, tasting something like normalcy. The SS officers responded differently. They met in hush, eyes hard and small in the lamplight, and spoke in harsh, clipped tones of doctrine and honor. Hauptsturmfer Heinrich Brandt paced the mess hall floor like a caged animal, his polished cap in hand, fingers worrying the chin strap. "We must not give them what they want," he hissed during one late night council. "Accept no comforts, accept no fraternization. To do so is treason." The men around him nodded, not from conviction so much as from fear of the consequences of dissent. Brandt's worldview had been carved by medals and ceremonies. It did not allow for steak and coffee. The presence of benevolence in the hands of a democratic enemy was a cognitive crack that widened with every polite exchange. Not all guards were angels. There were strict ones who enforced rules with a clenched jaw. There were also those who treated prisoners with a grudging respect, learned from the trenches of their own memories. Corporal Mallory, who had seen infantry work in North Africa, spoke to prisoners sometimes in clipped German he'd learned from an old neighbor. He disliked SS men, but he favored fairness. A clean bunk, the same rations, the same sanitation for all. It was discipline dressed as decency. That discipline, more than charity, was what unsettled the true believers among the prisoners. They expected cruelty. Instead, they found rules, fairness, and logistic competence. It was a comparison they had no category for. Stories began to leak out from the inside. The baseball game staged at the camp for prisoners, with American kids looking on from the bleachers, the church choir, its hymns floating across the compound, and the occasional invitation to work on local farms under guard, where prisoners found themselves under the open sky, planting corn alongside American farmers. On one quiet afternoon, a group of prisoners were allowed to help repair a town's water wheel, and the townspeople, wary but curious, offered iced tea. The spectacle stunned both sides. Americans seeing enemy soldiers sweat under their sun, Germans tasting an iced beverage that had never been part of ration life back home. Wires back to Europe reported these oddities in the same flat telegraph language they used to announce troop movements. Local German newspapers tried to spin the image. Americans pamper our men to humiliate them. Read one bulletin intercepted by camp intelligence. But the letters the prisoners sent home, when permitted, told a different story. Carefully censored, yes, but filled with sentences that confessed to the shock of hot baths, the discovery of fresh bread, and the small grace of a warm blanket. Oberleutnant Weber resisted the urge to write such things. He could sense the danger of admitting gratitude. He kept his letters formal, laconic, and dutiful, even as he found himself lingering over memories of steak in a way that made his stomach ache with something like shame. Tensions built not in sudden explosions, but in slow pressure. SS officers watched younger soldiers' faces soften as they learned to read a book in the Red Cross library or laugh, quietly, at an American vaudeville skit. Brandt's orders grew harsher. He demanded strict uniformity in inspection, called the men traitors if they accepted cigarettes or soap, and punished with isolation those who disobeyed, not by beatings so much as by enforced silence and the removal of small comforts. There was a psychological brutality here, the stripping away of dignity through ostracism, wielded as power to preserve ideology. For men who had already been through the village burnings and frontline collapses, this was a new kind of pressure. Yet human moments slipped through every fissure. A youthful private named Emil Schultz taught a small American boy how to fold a paper airplane from a scrap of camp paperwork, and the boy, eyes wide, threw it into the blue Texas sky. For a single instant, the world hiccuped into something else, a place where an enemy's hand could be steady and kind. For Emil, it was almost unbearable. The simple joy felt like betrayal. For the townspeople, occasional glimpses of these men working reparative labor complicated any tidy narrative of villain and victim. As months wore on and the war's tide rolled further toward Germany, the camp became a place of reckoning where material reality and political myth collided. Newsreels and papers from overseas reached the compound, edited, censored, and slanted, but still carrying word of Allied advances and Axis defeats. Men who had once believed in invincible victory began to measure their own country's ability in pallets of canned goods and well-stocked kitchens. The Americans' logistical superiority was not only apparent in military hardware, but in the simple mechanics of supply. Fuel rolling in, rail cars loaded with flour, and engineers who could produce 100 different kinds of canned stew in a single day. For those like Hauptsturmverband, each crate that arrived was an accusation rewritten in tin. Germany could not match this. The SS officer tightened his rhetoric and doubled down on ceremonial discipline. But discipline can only be held together so long when the men in your charge have tasted something better. A corporal named Otto Meyer, once a die-hard loyalist who had waved the swastika with zeal, found himself smiling at a civilian farmer who pressed a jar of honey into his hands after a long day's labor. The gesture was simple, and the honey was sweet, and Otto felt, in a flash of private reckoning, the old slogans fall away like so much clothing. He worried, then, not only for his men's souls, but for his own. Later, standing by the fence under a Texas moon, he would confess to a bunkmate that he had begun to think of a future that had nothing to do with flags or ideology. For the townspeople and the American soldiers, the presence of German POWs was a moral test as much as a logistical one. How to treat the enemy with justice when the enemy was implicated in crimes beyond imagining. This question split families and units. Some guards treated the prisoners strictly but humanely. Others harbored private resentments that erupted in small cruelties. But for all the messiness, the camp's general conduct, organized, provisioned, and lawful, forced a country at war to live up to its own ideals. Corporal Mallory, who had stared into the barrel of a German rifle in Sicily, kept to his rulebook. The Geneva Convention might be a piece of paper, but it was a standard he chose to keep. As the war in Europe crumbled and German supply lines ruptured under Allied pressure, repatriation plans began to form. Men who had once imagined a triumphant return to a rebuilt Reich now faced a journey across an ocean to a homeland in chaos. Packets of letters were written with hands that shook, apologies, admissions, confessions, and requests. Weber wrote one final time, carefully, to a wife whose name he had always spelled wrong in ribbons of nervous ink. He wrote not of battlefield heroics, but of small salvations, a bath, a blanket, a stranger's kindness. The letter was a confession of survival, and by the time it reached Germany, the front it remembered had already crumbled into rubble and rumor. The day of departure was anticlimactic and solemn. Freight trains came again, lined with black-painted cars, and the MPs read the names aloud as men boarded. The same Texas sun beat down, but now it carried with it an exhaustion that was not purely physical. Hugs were rare, nods and clasped hands more common. Some prisoners left with pockets stuffed with contraband. Chocolate, a coffee tin, a dog-eared novel. Small talismans against the abruptness of going back. Hop Sturmfer Brandt boarded with his chin high, but even he had softened in ways he refused to name. Otto Meyer, the former zealot, walked barefoot to the platform for a moment and watched the children run the length of the fence, paper airplanes in hand. He had learned a language, the language of ordinary kindness. It would stay with some men longer than any doctrine. When the trains vanished into the dust, the camp resumed its quiet. In the months and years that followed, the stories that left Herne diverged. Some men returned to a Germany in horror, some to shame, some to a quiet attempt at rebuilding life. A few, in letters that later surfaced in archives, spoke of the steak dinners and the cigarettes and the kindnesses that had so unsettled them. Small admissions that historians would later parse as evidence not of simple victory or defeat, but of a more complicated human truth. The archives preserved meal cards and ration lists as if they were artifacts of some subtle cultural victory, that a nation's civility might become, in the end, proof of its strength. The moral residue of those months in Texas lingered for decades. Veterans, American and German alike, carried memories of steamy mess tents and the smell of coffee like relics. Some returned to the site to place small stones of remembrance. Others refused to speak at all. In quiet conversations recorded in oral histories, former prisoners admitted that the shock of civility had been harder to manage than any gunfire. It forced them to reconcile what they had been taught with what they had seen. For some, the realization led to repentance. For others, it was a wound that never closed. The humiliation of being humanized by an enemy who had everything they had been promised would never be theirs. Camp Herne's story is not a parable of easy moral victory. It is a complicated, messy chapter where the mechanics of war, supply trucks, mess halls, Red Cross parcels, intersected with the fragile tissue of belief. The steak dinners were not propaganda. They were a byproduct of logistical superiority and an adherence to a standard of treatment, even for those who had fought for an evil cause. What they revealed, more than anything, was how fragile certainty can be when confronted with small acts of normalcy. The men who left Texas took with them not only scars and uniforms, but the knowledge that enemy hands could also be hands that warmed a mug of coffee, handed out soap, or offered a piece of bread.